All right, so you and I have spent a lot of time together, and I guess we've kind of discussed this stuff in a very limited scale, but what was it like growing up for you in the Shariff household, and what were you like growing up as a kid?
I had a very fortunate childhood. Me and my brother didn't want for anything. My dad is still at 83 years old a cardiologist. My mom is a social worker, so we were pretty spoiled, both of us, in terms of just wanting and getting whatever we wanted. Me and my brother, extremely competitive. Even to this day, I'd imagine if it was like having you as a little brother, we could still get in a fist fight here and there. We could still, wrestle and take it over the edge. It's still a good idea for us not to play games against one another. There's a smashed lampshade from a Madden video game. We'd come home and my mom would hide and get rid of the ping pong paddles, or we weren't allowed to go play basketball in the back because we just couldn't play with one another without it breaking into an all-out war. So I had a fantastic childhood, and I had a little brother who was always trying to beat me for the first time in all the different sports.
Well, so I asked about the childhood not just as like a throwaway question, but one of the things that stands out the most about you, and I certainly know this, I think that your listeners have picked up on this, but it's that competitiveness. And so I guess I'm curious where that comes from. Does it come from your brother Yusuf, or did you get it from your parents? Like, where did that really develop?
That's a really good question. I think you either you have it or you don't. Like my dad isn't from this country. My dad doesn't know anything about football. He knows about cricket. I'm not making a racial joke here, but it's true. He knows about cricket, and he would watch basketball with us. Like the only sport I would watch with my dad, he'd send me into the movie store to get, back then it was like WrestleMania, the Royal Rumble on VHS, and it came out like weeks or months later, and we'd watch that, me, him, and my brother, or we'd watch the NBA Finals. And I really attribute it to watching sports documentaries. Do you remember the 30 for 30s? Like, I grew up on those sports documentaries on ESPN Classic, and seeing the Michael Jordan stories, and obviously now with Kobe Bryant or Jerry West. And I just wanted to focus on how those guys, I don't care what it is. And I think, it's kind of why, a major reason that you and I get along and you're doing this series. I'm very interested in knowing what makes geniuses tick. I don't care what field it is, that me and you, if we're out to dinner, I know I ask the most questions of anyone. And I'm not doing it to be fake or that throwaway question that you reference. I want to know what makes these people brilliant and really, really successful. And I want to be at the top of my field. And I guess if I was going to, attribute it to one parent, I'd probably say my dad. My dad is a tireless worker. He cannot be home. He grinds. I've called him up with different medical things that are not in his field of cardiology or heart disease, and he'll just study on it and grind. My parents are both grinders. And then I think the competitive thing in terms of wanting to win is just either in you or it's not. So I would say, both my parents with the work ethic, and then watching Michael Jordan and Muhammad Ali and all these different stories of the greats, and this insatiable desire to be the best, and this obsession that Jerry West had or MJ had. And then I took a lot of my competitiveness and all that stuff from watching the, documentaries and stories of my favorite athletes and sports people.
All right, I got a lot of questions that come from this. The first, though, so you and I have a lot in common. You referenced that. One of the things we have in common is that we have family members not from this country. You with your dad, I'm the only one in my family born here. Now, my dad, who's from South Africa, grew up playing sports. And so I kind of grew up in a sports household. Did your dad grow up playing sports, even though it wasn't here in this country? Did he have a big love for sports?
Nope. No love for sports. My dad isn't particularly coordinated. I think he'd kick around the soccer ball a little bit, and he might play a little bit of cricket. And that is it. For me, it was my mom. Like, the first sport I played, she just said, get in the car, and we went to a Little League tryout. And that was like my first experience with like T-ball. And my mom is the one that would throw to me in the backyard, or my mom would go to the tennis court with me. And my dad is always working, you know, he'd get home at 7 or 8 p.m. and it would be my mom that is sitting there practicing the sports or playing horse with me. Like, I can sit there and impersonate all my mom's different techniques on a court or on a field or throwing the football with me. So my mom was kind of like the sports dad. So no, my dad has zero sports experience in terms of playing it. None. I didn't even real quick I grew up without cable. So, like, in terms of loving sports, my buddy Jake, who you've met, we've gone out to lunch with. My parents live in the country, so we didn't have like cable television. I'm talking ESPN, TBS, TNT. I had regular, you know, bunny ear channels. So when there was a game that I was obsessed with, he would sit there and hold the phone up to the TV, and that's how I'd follow along with the biggest games. But zero sports influence from my dad. It was my mom who I was playing all the games with.
Okay, sports aside, just in general, what was it like for you growing up with, in this case, your dad being from another world, essentially, in a different culture, and getting that side of things?
Very disciplined. My dad, you know, I always remember him preaching like culture and manners and conduct yourself in this type of way. And, you know, like when my brother and I would walk into the house, the first rule was go wash your feet. So, like, if you come over to my house now, it drives me insane, and it always amazes me how people put their shoes on their couch or how they put their shoes on their bed. Like, even on TV, I'll be watching, and these people are putting their shoes on their bed. Or when someone comes to my house and they put their shoes, like, on the chase or whatever the middle thing is in the middle of the living room by the couch, I stare at it until they get the message, like, take your shoes off. So my dad was, wash your feet. You've been dirty all day. He would teach me manners at the table, you know, on how to etiquette school he went to. So with the spoon, make sure you're eating soup going outwards. Don't sit there and slurp it towards you. Proper English, proper grammar, how to respect your elders. It doesn't matter with my dad if he says that the freaking sky is orange. You have to say it's orange because he's older than you, and older people know more. So my dad is very, very big in terms of, you know, conducting yourself properly, having manners, act like, you know, you've been raised the right way. And he's very big on morals and ethics, you know, like, he's a physician, and he'll always bend the rules for the patient. You know, he believes in doing the right thing. You sent me a text the other day, and I get myself in trouble at work. You sent me a text saying, yeah, you know, I respect how sometimes you'll put your neck on the line to maybe get in trouble. And I think that's because of my mom and dad, because they always preach doing the right thing all the time, as corny as that sounds.
Well, that's something we're going to get into in a little bit. But for people who don't know, your dad is from...
He's from India. My dad's side of the family split up in India and Pakistan.
Got it. And your mom is American.
Yep, she's straight American. She's got a lot of German in her family tree, but she was born and raised in Maryland, and she has not left.
Okay. And so your dad's in medicine. Did you ever want to get into medicine, or from an early age were you pretty set on doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, not medicine. I always knew, like, I know I'm not very book smart. Now, I didn't try as hard as I could, but I knew I wasn't very book smart, and I give my dad a lot of credit. Like, in those types of families, the stereotype is always, well, you got to grow up and be a doctor, you got to grow up and be a physician, you got to grow up and be an attorney, right? And he never pressured me, man. I know it kind of broke his heart a little bit that my brother and I were not next in line to take over his practice. My brother is an attorney, so one of us fit the stereotype, but I never thought about getting into medicine. I knew I was not smart enough. I hated school, so I didn't want to do extra schooling. So I think they knew I was going to do something sports related because I never left the couch with any games on. He had a rule: 1 day a week. You can watch TV one night a week. That's all you get because, you know, it was just garbage on TV, garbage. So I'd save it for Monday Night Football. So I think they knew for a long time that it was going to be sports, and they never gave me a hard time about it, which I do appreciate that, because that can be pretty rare.
All right, so a second ago you mentioned speaking your mind and stuff, and I think that is another defining characteristic of yours. You'll stand up for what you believe in, and I think that permeates from just daily life to your show. Not that you're necessarily using that platform to constantly go out of your way to have a social impact when it doesn't exist by any means. But like I think your listeners again would probably not peg you as someone who's going to just tuck your tail between your legs and walk away. I think in a good way. You are opinionated. You will say what you believe, and you don't mind disagreeing with people. Where did that all come from? I know you mentioned your mom, but was that something you also always had, or was that something that kind of developed somewhere along the line of your journey to where you are now?
I mean, I think that's your parents. Like I would probably be voted as the biggest pain in the ass in the building when it comes to being an employee. I think my bosses know I'm coming from the right spot, but if you said, guess who is raising a stink about this, or guess who has a problem with this policy, or guess who thinks this isn't fair, I know that they probably have my name come out of their mouth. But my mom being a social worker is a huge thing with that. Like, my mom goes into homes every day, and she has a tremendous amount of compassion. She's a saint. She's an angel. I always tell her she's going to heaven, on an escalator for just doing the right thing. She just thinks that if you have a lot, that you have an obligation, you have to share it. And my dad cares about people's health. He doesn't care if you don't have the insurance payment. He doesn't care if you can't afford it. He doesn't care if he has to skirt the system. He was a pain in the ass for all the hospitals he worked for. He's been fired from jobs because he said, yeah, I'll take the job, but you have to hire my friend. He liked to pick fights. He liked to get into arguments. So my mom doing the right thing from a compassion, kind, warm standpoint as a social worker, and my dad just saying, look, it doesn't matter if these are the rules and these are the regulations and this is the system. I'm not going along with it. And even if I do go along with it, you're going to hear from me, and you're going to know that I have a problem with it. And there's a way, not just to be a pain in the ass. I don't ever try to I don't want to argue just for the sake of arguing. I just think if something's not fair, something needs to be done, then people need to know that you're not just going to lay down and take it all the time. And a lot of that, I have a lot of friends who they're like, oh man, I just can't speak up. I can't say the same thing sometimes that you do. All of that is luck in terms of the environment and the situation I came from. If I can say some things sometimes or take stances because I don't have to worry about my next check necessarily. It goes back to growing up very, very lucky in a family who is pretty well off. So I don't always have to worry about that safety net not being there underneath, and that allows you to be a little more, risky and a little more outspoken. So I got to credit my parents for that, because I understand people having to make choices based upon, that next paycheck and job status. But I've always been able to go out a little bit more on a limb, I think, because I had that safety net of what my parents accomplished themselves.
And I'll also say this, too. I mean, you and I will butt heads. I know I bug the crap out of you kind of like a little brother, and you sort of mentioned that earlier, but I also know of anyone in this building, if I need something, you're going to be the first person in line to fight for me. And I think that's the case for a lot of us, that you will be the first person to kind of get out in the front line and fight for someone. So before we kind of move away from this, I don't want people to move on in their mind without hearing that from me. But we could go on and on with what makes you tick for an hour. But I want to get on to some other stuff. So you go to American University. So you stay, pretty close to home for school. And I guess was that your first exposure to doing broadcasting in any format, or had you done stuff when you were in high school?
High school, I interned for the local radio station. So the local radio station in my town, was like a 4-station cluster in this little small building. They did country, oldies, news talk, and like FM pop hits. So that was the first radio experience of interning at that radio station in high school.
Okay, so I know it's different for everyone. Some people go to college and they don't ever do anything that they set out to do from their time at college or whatever. But how was your college experience impactful to what you're doing right now?
Man, my mom hates this answer. And again, part of the blame is on me because of I didn't try as hard, and I was in a fraternity and failing out of classes and drinking away days and weeks and all that, my own stupidity. But man, I can't really recall anything from college. To me, college, at least for me, was a maturation experience. You know, how am I going to work? How am I going to party? How am I going to conduct myself with all this freedom? I can't remember one thing from a broadcast journalism class. I think journalism ethics was my favorite class with a Dr. Watson. But I interned at the George Michael Sports Machine. George Michael Sports Machine was like Sports Center before Sports Center.
And you interned there.
Yeah, I interned there for him. And that's what I remember that experience the most in terms of charting games and just watching the personalities, how it works behind the scenes, from production to the way the set is set up. So I would say more. I can definitely remember more from that NBC4 George Michael internship than anything when it comes to college and broadcast journalism, which is what I majored in.
All right, so you're helping me with this segue because that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about. I don't know. I mean, people older than us certainly know who George Michael is. People our age range may or may not. Certainly, people younger than me have no clue who George Michael is. But he's, as you mentioned, he was like a big deal, and he passed away about a decade ago. But how did you land that internship? That's a pretty big deal. I mean, I guess like a comparison. You made the Sports Center comparison, but that's like someone in college or, a young person interning for like Stuart Scott or Dan Patrick. I mean, like he was a big deal. So how did you get that, and what was that experience like, being able to be around that environment?
I got it, I believe, through school. I remember the guy who helped me out with Adam Aperian was a guy I looked up to in college. But I can't remember if he connected me to it or it was just being offered up through our communications program. I think it was the communications program. George wasn't as big then because obviously Sports Center had been out for a while. Now I went to college from 99 to 03, so obviously there were a lot more sports outlets that were there for you to consume your news. And it wasn't a mind-blowing experience. I was probably a little bit disappointed. I saw some of George's personality and the ego behind the scenes, and you basically went in and you learn how to chart games. So you sit there and you write down a timestamp, 10-23-13, Adrian Beltre with the crazy highlight play. You're basically creating highlight packages that go into the sports reel. So I'm picking out the 4 or 5 best plays of the game. You're charting every single player, actually the highlight plays, because first I was interested in play-by-play. So I'm sitting there trying to practice the play-by-play to myself as I'm looking at all these games on a wall of monitors, which was really, really cool. But you're basically taking notes on the best plays, handing them over to a producer and someone way above you, and then they review the 3 or 4 plays, and does that make it into the broadcast? And then you go in and watch the taping. And this would be late in an inconvenient time, and George just loved having an audience. So I just tried to go as often as I could to sit there and have George see my face, and you sat there and watched him on his rinky-dink set, which it looked awesome on TV, but you saw, him hitting these cardboard boxes of the play and the rewind, and you watch a guy perform in front of the camera, and that's the way that went. It wasn't a mind-blowing internship. At the same time, I would drive weekends back to my hometown and do a TV internship at my local station. So I'd drive 2 hours. I'd get done with my classes on Friday, and I would drive 2 hours to Salisbury, Maryland. Salisbury is probably like 45 minutes past my hometown. Salisbury University, legendary D3 Seagull program, about 40 minutes from Ocean City, Maryland, and I would intern there doing TV for the weekends, and that's where I got really great hands-on work. You got to carry the camera out to every single event. You got to chart. You got to learn how to edit. You get to go on air. So that was really the best college experience for me, about 2 hours away near my hometown.
All right, so, and I'm sure I might be skipping stuff along the way, but you mentioned play-by-play. So you spent some time broadcasting in the CBA? I don't think you and I have ever talked about this.
No, CBA, the Rockford Lightning, the Continental Basketball Association. So, like, again, I love the NBA. Like, you know, if I could be Marv Albert or Bob Costas, that's what I wanted to do. You know, I didn't love baseball as much as I did basketball. So I'm like, I want to do NBA play-by-play. So I graduated, and I sent out my resume. I didn't have a resume tape for play-by-play, but my resume to every single CBA team, every single minor league team, baseball, basketball, did not matter.
Wait, can I ask you a quick question? Did you not,
yeah.
were the opportunities not there at American for you to broadcast like American sporting events on like the student station? Because I know every school is very different in like what opportunities exist and don't exist.
Right. But this is where I was lazy and dumb. Like, I didn't say, hey, let me go be the I didn't apply myself to go be the play-by-play voice of Americans basketball team. We had Jeff Jones there, who coached at Virginia.
Yeah.
And you know, we have a D1 sports program, even though there's no football. So I definitely should have tried to do that more. But I was pledging, and I was worried about having fun, and I was, you know, drunk in classes, and I'm like, I'm not going to do all this stuff. So that's why I screwed up in not having a resume tape. But the CBA, Rockford Lightning, Isaiah Thomas used to run this team, be part of the league. And they're like, you can come here. You got to work 9 to 5 in our sales office. That'll be the money you make off commission, or however many season tickets you sell. And then we'll set you up with a roommate, and you can be the color analyst. I wasn't even the play-by-play guy. I was a color analyst. So I'm as qualified as Fisher was for your broadcast and the Legends. So yeah, I was a color analyst for the Rockford Lightning for 1 year. Worst town I've ever lived in. And I fought tooth and nail with the coach, who was also the, you know, GM all the time. So I went back home in the off season, and I never left after that.
All right. So again, I mentioned we're going to be skipping ahead, but you prior to coming to the Metroplex, you were in Kansas City and had a lot of success in Kansas City. One of the things I want to ask you, because I experienced this when I lived in Michigan, and I had to do a talk show. What are some of the challenges of being a sports talk show host and personality in a city in which you are clearly not from? And not only do the listeners know that, but you also maybe, when you get there at least, don't totally understand all of the sports history that goes into being a fan in that city.
Yeah, huge problem, you know. And now I understand why, you know, before I was like, why doesn't this boss want to hire me? Or why can't I get into this market? And why this? Well, I know I'm better than this person. And, you know, that's probably the thing I would probably say is my biggest achievement personally and with RJ is having the success in DFW that we've had given our backgrounds. You know, we're both from the East Coast. The ticket here is established kind of more chill, easy listening radio. We're loud, boisterous, kind of in your face. We like to argue and debate. A lot of people frown upon that, look down. And then, you know, I grew up in Maryland and DC, and I was a Redskins fan. And that's probably the biggest mistake I made in coming here. Now I give credit. Bruce Gilbert hired me. And Bruce is thought of as, you know, one of the Michael Jordans of programming. And he said, you know, the best advice we all get, right? Be yourself. And I was like, screw it. I'm just going to be myself, and I'm going to be honest. And if it irritates some people, then, you know, the old Howard Stern line of, you know, people will listen if they love you, and the other half will listen if they hate you. So I'm just going to be honest about it and, you know, get under some people's skin. And with my honesty, I wasn't doing an act or a bit. And that definitely was a mistake, you know, because you're going to lose some fans that are never, ever going to come back. But In Kansas City, it was a little bit easier because I'm not going in as a fan of any of the rival teams. You know, I'm not going in as a Denver Bronco fan who also loves the Kansas City Royals rival. So I tried my hardest to sit there and learn about all the teams, respect the history, go out to Kauffman Stadium for every game that I could, go out to Arrowhead, go to Lawrence, which I did for, Jayhawks Missouri games. So it's really, really tough, man. It's really, really challenging. And that's why I'm really, really appreciative of the listeners we have in DFW, like not totally shutting us off and giving us a chance, because Texas is a very stubborn place. It's a very provincial market. But I think people respect that I'm going to be honest, and I don't want to see the Cowboys do badly. That's why I'm always honest in terms of saying I want the Cowboys to go undefeated every year and win the Super Bowl every year, along with the Mavericks, Stars, and Rangers, because that creates a sports ratings bonanza. I always care about my career over my favorite teams. I always say I root for ratings. I don't root for any teams anymore outside of DFW, because that's best for business and that's best for the wallet and the paycheck and the ratings. But coming in and overcoming that non-local label, it's a humongous challenge.
That was I think back when I first started in Michigan, and you know this about me, I'm a sports junkie, so it was not an issue at all for me to know about the present-day Red Wings and Lions and Tigers and Pistons and even recent history, but it was more like, every sports team's fan base has those moments, like you say a player's name and they know exactly what you're talking about, that if you're not from that city, and if you didn't really grow up a fan of that team, like it's tough to know, but you don't want to also get caught with your pants down. And it's like, it's not your fault that you grew up in Maryland and now you're covering the Chiefs, but like you better know about this, that, and that. And that to me was like, that was so tough. And it was also, I think like I'm with you in like, I don't know. I think like
for me and you, it's never going to be a problem to learn it. Okay. I never went into Kansas City and said, oh man, I'm going to have to learn about Derek Thomas, Neil Smith. I never said, oh, I'm going to have to learn about Paul Pierce and what's Bill Self doing now. The challenge, at least for me, is localizing it as the memory, right? So now I can say, 2011, where was I? I was at the Fan Sports Lounge by the AAC.
Right.
I was on Greenville Avenue when the Cowboys beat Seattle. I wanted to sit there and go to Whataburger because I was partying till 3:00 in the morning. That localizes you. That puts you, that puts you in someone's backyard. Where I was in Denton, I was in Mesquite, I was in Garland. That's very hard to do when you move somewhere and you have no idea what the freak is uptown, and you have no idea that Fort Worth isn't 5 minutes from Dallas because it's DFW. Those are the things that you cannot be prepared for.
How did you?
Does that make sense?
No. Absolutely. I mean, I live that as well, so I know exactly what you're talking about. How did you, as a sports talk show host, when do you remember being really comfortable with your style? Because I think like whether it's play-by-play, I'm sure anchoring, sports talk, as much as you go out there with the idea of being you still have to figure out like what works. And I guess it's also tough when you've got co-hosts, because you can't do it in a vacuum. You've got to also consider what works for them so that it works for both of y'all. But when did you, like, was there a moment or was there a period of time where you're like, I'm really starting to get this? I don't have all the answers, but I'm now sort of starting to make progress, and I'm having a way better understanding of how to do this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, it's twofold. One, I only hosted a solo show here. Like, so for 5 years in my hometown, And then for 1 year in Kansas City before I left, I was just used to a solo show. So like, I think when I went to Kansas City, you always have confidence, but I was scared of, okay, this is major radio now. I knew that there was, there was 150 people listening in my hometown. There's 10,000 people. Maybe there's 100 people listening. Maybe. And I can screw up here. And I can sit here and talk about I still remember talking about field hockey recaps and and lacrosse scores from every local high school and calling Little League games on a Friday. That's what I was doing on my Friday and Saturday nights. I was at the Little League park, after graduating college, and there's no one's going to ding me for messing up what happened in the bottom of the fifth inning with an 8-year-old. But now Kansas City, we're dealing with the Chiefs and Jayhawks and Royals and big time programs. And after I got rating success and like really accepted in Kansas City in my short time there, I was really, really confident. And then I came to Dallas, and I think the guys would all tell you that it was really almost, I made it almost impossible to have a successful show the way that we have one now. My mentality was, I know more than all these guys. I work harder. I want it more. I've never been unsuccessful. So I'm going to come in here, and I basically did like my solo show, and then would call on RJ to like chime in. Or I would call on Troy, like, okay, I'm going to get on my podium. I'm going to host my show. I'm going to do things my way. And then you are going to be the side dishes. And it wasn't until probably even like four years ago where I was like, this needs to not be podium radio. It's got to be more conversational. Because in my mind, Jared, I was always making a resume tape, And a resume tape is me going on a 3 or 4 minute rant and having the passion and saying something really strong that I did believe. I'm not being fake, but it was me. That's the way my entire career was. And then 4 or 5 years ago, a light clicked for me of, okay, I can loosen up a little bit. I can still be the guy. I always wanted to be MJ and not Pippen. I can still be the guy and the leader while making these guys better. But embarrassingly, as embarrassing it is to admit, that didn't happen until 4 or 5 years ago, because I was used to just a solo show, and it was like me and a couple of assistants, and that's not the way the best shows sound, I don't think.
Well, and that's cool for me to hear, because that's about the time when you and I really started, not met, but although we only met probably a year prior to that, but really started to develop our relationship, and I would hear, we'd have these conversations about your show and this and that, and so I wanted to ask, like, what the biggest adjustment you had to make was. You kind of just touched on it, but you and RJ.
And the other adjustment was this, real quick.
Yeah.
So our strategy, right? When we started our show, the ticket is doing more guy talk, laid back radio. 103.3 still has a national sports feel to it. So we all looked at this and said, there's the opening in the market. Like, let's just go all local sports. Let's just go all local sports. Well, how is one of the other two stations not just doing that 24/7? So because I took that like a little bit too serious, my biggest mistake was not being loose enough. I was all sports, and we're not doing guy talk, and we're not cracking a lot of jokes. We're doing thought-provoking, intriguing, different sports radio on the local teams. That I put in my mind as the formula. That's what the boss wants. That's the game plan. And I know, and he would probably tell you he wanted me to loosen up a little bit, but I was just like a drill sergeant with the game plan. And then Gavin Spittle came in, and he really talked me into loosening up. And he's like, show us a little bit more of the personality. And you can do 70% sports or 80% sports in 20%. I needed to improve my likability. I needed to let people know how much I love barbecuing. I needed to let people know that I have small hands, that you can make, brown skin jokes towards me, and that I can't do anything around the house, or what my personal life is, or fighting with my brother nonstop. And I was guilty of not allowing any of that in the first 4 or 5 years of the show. And then that kind of transition when Spittle was like, hey, let's try to go a little 80-20 here. And then finally I backed off the gas a little bit.
Okay, so it's easy to say that, and it's easy. Like I think one of your great skills is your awareness, but like it's easy to say like I need to do this, this, and that. How did you actually go about doing it? Because I know you don't just go home and sit on your ass and then you show up and do the show the next day. I know you think about the show a lot and think about how to do this and how to do that. So can you remember back then, like what were the things you were doing to get you from what you knew you needed to do to actually doing it?
Well, I would sit here. So, like, if I look at my show sheet right now, it's a sheet of blocks, and there's 18 blocks. So I would sit here and say, okay, at 6 a.m. we're going to go sports. At 6:20 we're going to go sports, and then in one of those blocks we're going to go lighthearted. So let's try out of the 4 segments we have to do a lighthearted segment that the guys want to talk. I mean, RJ and Troy were dying to do this, right? Like I know, that you don't even have to hook them up to a lie detector. They would view me out sick or out for a vacation as a vacation for themselves, like because they grew up on this guy talk radio here. RJ's been here for 15 years. So, and RJ's a goofball anyway. RJ wants to mess around. And I knew they were dying to do this. So I was like, okay, I'll give in. Let's do one segment of the hour as guy talk, as fun. We did a what's trending thing. I came up with that. When I'm looking at Twitter, I'm like, what are these hashtags? This is stupid hashtag stuff. And I'm like, let's pick 3 of these things that are trending, that are non-sports, and let's talk about them. And Gavin Spittle was a big game show guy. So Gavin would help us. Troy's very creative in that aspect as well. Let's come up with a game show to play once or twice a week. So that's how that stuff kind of started happening. What's trending was, or we actually did guess what day it is? We started that on our show at 6:40. I was like, what are these National Day things? And then we went away with that, and I think G-Bag kind of picked up on it. But that's how that stuff started. Let's do one funny segment per hour, and then we'll get back to the sports. And let's kind of keep that going so that 4 segments of our show are going to be non-sports, and we can balance it a little bit. That's how that went.
So you essentially forced yourself into this through content.
Yes.
All right. Now, I think people know this. When you do a show with someone, it's not always a given that you're going to have a great relationship. There are ups and downs, and I think you and RJ certainly have evolved a ton. But I can honestly say, you guys, and I get the chance. One of the most enjoyable weeks of the year is when we're in spring training together, and it's and we all are just kind of hanging out, and we're isolated from any other distractions, really. But you and RJ really do get along, and I think you guys get along better now than you ever have. But it's just like anything. I love my wife, you love your fiance, but you guys argue, you fight. It happens. How have you grown? How is the marriage between you and RJ evolved? And I guess how proud are you that you've been able to develop this relationship with someone who, in a lot of ways, is a polar opposite personality-wise to you?
Yeah, very good question. A lot of that credit, honestly, has to go to RJ's personality. Like I'm a difficult person sometimes to get along with. I'm much more all these things. I'm much more temperamental. I'm much more likely to explode. I care about the ratings and the competitiveness of it much more than Choppy. But I need like a polar opposite in that. If RJ was this alpha male, high intensity, temperamental person, we would have long ago killed ourselves. We would have murdered ourselves. But like I really need RJ as an opposite because he's easygoing. He's funny. He's not sensitive. I'm way oversensitive. He doesn't take anything too seriously. He's got a bigger perspective on life. He's got 2 kids, was married, a long time ago. So he's probably got, for RJ, it used to drive me crazy with RJ that I felt like he never wanted it as much as I did. I would still probably say that that's the case, but that's good for us because RJ lets me have control. You know, I'm a total control freak. Like, I have to manipulate it. I want my head on the chopping block if it goes bad, and I want my name being mentioned first if it goes good. That's just being honest with my ego. Like, I'm just being totally honest with you. And RJ, RJ is a prep monster. You know, before I would say, oh, I did one more story of prep. RJ doesn't want it as much. I know I'm still up at midnight for this 9:30 Rangers game. RJ doesn't want it as much. I have 17 interview questions prepared. RJ has 8. RJ doesn't want it as much. And I had to get over like being so resentful and thinking that we had to be equal in terms of prep because I judged you off prep. I mean, I can't tell you how many guys I'm like, no, won't work with him. He doesn't work hard enough. No, this guy sent 3 or 4 topics. I don't ever want to work with him again. No, this guy's lazy. Like, I have a huge, huge standard when it comes to how much work I think you're putting in. And RJ, he'll do it in different ways. RJ will go make the dumb Facebook Live video when I kind of don't want to put myself out there as much in terms of my personality. And I'm fine with coming up with the extra interview questions while RJ is thinking of the dumb, funny personal story. So RJ is a prep beast. I guarantee you, no one in Dallas-Fort Worth, nobody, no one preps as hard as we do for our show, and I put RJ at the very, very top. But I think RJ adjusted too. I think 4 or 5 years ago, RJ's focus and concentration on the show during the course of the show, I think he was going through some personal stuff in his own life where his concentration wasn't always there. And I think RJ in the last 4 or 5 years has locked in, and I recognize that, and I think that's why we are where we are today.
All right, last question, Shan, and I appreciate the time. I'd be remiss to not ask you about barbecue. Where did this love of barbecuing come from? Did this just kind of was this a late in life discovery, or have you always been really kind of interested in, I guess the science of food, really? Because you don't just go and barbecue and throw a picture on. I mean, you're crowdsourcing, you're studying it. I mean, this is like, I work with Eric Nadel, and Eric's got this love of music, and it's deeper than I think people truly realize, like his passion for it, and that's like the best comparison I can make to you and your love of barbecuing and really food.
Cooking food always, but barbecuing myself is just straight Texas. That's it. I didn't know anything about a big green egg before Texas. I didn't know what an indirect plate was before Texas. I didn't know what woods to use before Texas. And I looked at it, and I was like, this is the way to be judged around here. Like, it was part love of food, part wanting to fit in, and then part competition. Like, okay, you're going to be judged and looked upon how you smoke a brisket around here. So, let's just dive into it and see if I can make better ribs or wings than Gavin Dawson, which apparently I can't better than Gavin Dawson 0 for 2. But, can I master this as something that is viewed as religion around here? So I didn't know anything about barbecuing or how to smoke something, brisket, ribs, or anything else until I moved here. I got a big green egg, and then I just dove into it, and I'm like, I want to try to be fantastic at this, and that's where that came from. But I've always loved food, as you do.
Dude, that's perfect. That's it. That's all I need from you, and I appreciate you spending some time to chat with us.
Well, Sandler, thank you for the time. I really am honored to do this. This is kind of like my own ESPN Classic Sports Century, so I feel honored. And I want to say this. You can cut this out of the interview because I know that you'll be embarrassed by it. But the reason that Jared and I click is because we have the same desire to succeed. Like, I know not to mess with him when when we're in Arizona in Surprise. He is not coming home or getting ready to go out unless all his work is done. And I really was embarrassed a little bit by my own schedule, complaining about it out there, because we have to get up at 3:30 in the morning and be on air at 4:30. Well, Sandler's up 30 minutes after we are. He's in the gym, and then he's coming home at 6 p.m. versus 8 a.m. because he's grinding. So you are a grinder. And I love knowing what makes people tick, and I respect people's work ethic. No one has a higher work ethic than you. And in terms of loyalty, I will stick my neck out there for anyone if I know that they're loyal to me, and no one is more loyal than Jared Sandler. So from a work ethic standpoint, a grinder, someone who's a great friend, Jared Sandler's the guy for that, and you can go ahead and cut this out of the interview, please. So thanks for having me.
I won't cut it out on the condition that I got to throw this last line in there. Now will you please answer the phone when I call?
No. Jared said earlier we bump heads. We don't bump heads. It's just an irritation over text that I don't respond to or calls that I don't respond to because I'm bad with the phone. And Jared just gets more and more worried and more anxious. That's the only time we go back and forth. We don't butt heads because we understand each other. And brother, I love you. Thanks for having me.
Love you too, dude.